principle-based education systems change? What can we count on? Now, you know I grew up on a farm, and one of the things that my family would say, Gary, maybe you know this too, when we were really sure of something, we would end up saying, you can bet the farm on it. Is that right? And it occurred to me that a way of talking about what has happened in this year-long webinar is to identify the outcomes that we can count on and to talk about the essentials for effective systems change. That's a mouthful. But we've learned some things together that are really surprising. We came together as a collection of 3 principals educators, experienced in some cases for as much as 45 years, bringing the understanding, living the principles in classrooms and school systems, and others who are relatively new and standing on the shoulders of those who've been at this for a long time. We didn't know each other entirely. We had not met as a collective group. But it struck me the other day, there are some things that have become very, very clear. And one of the lessons that we've learned, without question, is that we need to understand that there is a process for bringing the principles into our work in education that starts with us. It's important that we learn the principles, discover them actually, and then that we have experience living those principles in our personal lives, and then it spills over into our professional life. So that third phase in the process of integrating the principles in schools is sharing. And that's a word I didn't necessarily use myself at the beginning of this year-long time with all of you. We talked about teaching the principles for many years. And you'll recall that Marika Mayer said to us so clearly, we are the principles. And we remember very clearly Peter Anderson using the simple words that some of us had been familiar with and some had not. And that is that the principles are simply a description of how we operate from the inside out. And that fundamental understanding of the, I'm going to call it the perfect order, for moving in the direction of integrating the principles in schools really does depend on us learning or discovering those principles and then living them to the point of experiencing the real essence of our being. And then that leads to a natural desire to share the principles. It's not like we reach out there and grab something that we package up as a 200-page curriculum, so to speak, and bring it in. But we're talking about actually being motivated to come from, as Barb Ost talked to us so clearly, to come from that experience of the essence of who we are, of how we operate. And we're grateful for the simple, clear teachings and materials of Sid Banks, for pointing us in the direction of how that inside out nature that is ours, that is shared, operates, of mind, thought, and consciousness. We'll talk more about that. But the key point for me is that there is a continuum when we start thinking about changing things in schools, from me, maybe intellectually, or maybe in terms of a heartfelt something. And I begin to understand that more and more deeply, and then live it personally, professionally, and then be motivated to share. That continuum in the process is really critical. There's another continuum that I think emerged for us, and that is simply that we move in various individual ways from what I would call the form to formless. And in simplest terms, we might say that when I first encountered or went to a training and heard anything at all about what was then called health realization and now is called Three Principles, my encounter with that was essentially a psychological understanding, and it had a lot of form to it. It was very accurate, but it wasn't complete. There was something that I myself sensed was there, and that came because I had previous life experiences that told me that there's a spiritual dimension to being human, and that complements the physical, the intellectual, and the emotional. But it's sort of like if we were driving a car with 3 wheels, it wouldn't work very well. And so on my own, and many of you in the webinar series talked about how in your own life at an early point you added that understanding of the deep essence. And when you heard the 3 principles described as more than form, then it moved on the continuum of understanding to a much more formless knowledge and experience. I think there's another continuum that happened to become obvious in this webinar series. And that is that, and I think of Karen Seashore at the University of Minnesota, who's known for her fabulous lifelong research about improvement of urban schools. And she always said that it was professional learning communities that would be the vehicle for changing schools for the better. And she found an interesting thing. When she orchestrated the creation of learning communities for educators in school systems, school buildings, departments, as people collaborated, got to know each other, and understand each other beyond the scope of their specific discipline, history, math, so on, they began to change their priorities. I mean, this is powerful research. And she said what happened was that the professional discipline moved down from being #1 priority, and the priority went on to students. When we talk about the 3 principles understanding, we talk about living in a state of service. And that just means that we're out of ourselves. We are connected to the essence, the best that we are as human beings, if you would like. And when we have that in education, it means that we can see the best in students. in colleagues, in ourselves. So that continuum of going deeper and seeing more broadly is an important part. Many of us have formed connections that matter, that have produced amazing projects and activities and products. It's been an amazing year. And as I look at each of you, I think of Joel Drosner, what you've been doing in Los Angeles as a result of just being part of this, or Bob Shell, how you've been so faithful to be here. There's something about this collaborative process, and we've all kind of learned to tolerate the new technology and let it be something that can move us. That's amazing. Probably the most powerful thing that I think has happened was articulated by Krista Kamsel. And Krista, I will unmute you now and then just give you a little insight into what I'm looking for here. I remember in one of the sessions, you talked about your amazement at what you saw unfolding as all of these unconnected people came together in this webinar. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
It was, yes, thank you. Good morning. It was not long into the process when I was really touched and fascinated by how I'd listen to someone and I'd go, that's my experience too. And as more and more people joined in, I could see that we're all having the same type of experience. As you say, our own learning, I can see we're all students of this. The feeling of hope we all have, the feeling of joy and gratitude of seeing our students be able to turn towards a healthy life path. Something that really, I must say, really touched me deeply, being as I was in, I've always had a feeling for kids who struggle, and being in special ed, something that really deeply touched me is how each one of us, never mind the roles we have, because I'm pleased there are so many different roles that the educators have on this call, but just the natural tendency to connect with a student who's struggling. And sometimes it's beyond struggling. It was beyond, we all know kids that have been in severe distress. And that just that loving and caring to reach out and connect with these kids and have them say things like, I didn't believe it was going to work, but I'm surprised it does. Or this stuff really, really does help. Thank you. And kids really finding their own wisdom and their own power within. And then the additional beauty of all of us seeing for however many years, running into these kids later or connecting with them as I am as young professionals, and them being able to articulate, yeah, when I was with you and I was 9 years old and learned this, it was a defining moment. And it's become the foundation of how I live my life. And now I'm, 28 years old. It's very powerful and very encouraging. So I was really pleased with the feeling of hope that permeated each and every talk, and this the definite results that are long-standing and actually get deeper.
Krista, one of the things that you said that just struck me, and maybe it's because I've been at the university for so many years, but you said, somebody should do a content analysis of these webinars.
Yes.
All of the research has been gathered. Now it has to be analyzed. There's, in a sense, a master's or a doctoral dissertation in here looking at the text of these webinars, because there is such consistency in terms of what happens to the educator, you yourself, what happens to students, and what happens to the climate, and what happens to parents who get interested and want to be involved. And I think at some moment here, Deb Bell is going to be ready to step in, but until we do, Bob, I can unmute you and ask you, because you've been involved with education and the principals the longest of all of us, 45 years almost.
40.
40, okay. And
Not that old.
And Deb Bell has joined us. She's one of the more recent learners, and the two of you have been connected in these webinars, which is just amazing all the way across the world. But when you listen to the webinar series, what happened to you? What did you see? What did you experience? What do you make of it?
Similar to Krista, that there's a thread that runs through what everybody's saying, even though we've never, a few of us have met each other, but most of us haven't met one another. And yet it's as though we've sat in the staff room and talked to one another and had one of these communities of learning that is talking about how we can be involved in school improvement, just as though we were a group that met every month together. And I've been astonished by that, how much commonality there has been that has run through the whole thing. And what I've picked up is that people have a deep trust for coming from inside out. And that seems to be the most important thing of all, that we're all living in this place. We've rested back. We're sitting back in that place of trust that wisdom will come through us, and that it is truly an inside-out world. And we may not have a form that tells us what to do, but we do. We have this invisible, incredible intelligence that is guiding all of us. And I think that that's the piece that connects us all together, is that that invisible piece is speaking to each one of us. One of the most important pieces of learning for me came from Deb Bell. And it was when she said, something about, we just have to trust that teachers know what to say, what story to read, what to share. And I thought, bingo, says it all. If we trust and we live in that place of total trust that the right thing will come in that teachable moment, by teaching in the moment and being in the moment, it will all work. So in its simplicity, that for me has been the big message. Trust.
I'm going to unmute Deb. She's here with us on the fly between her little break time in class. And Barb, I'm going to leave you with us. My question for you, Barb, is really because you just mentioned the teachable moment. Do you have something you want to comment about there or tell us?
You mean about my article?
Yeah.
Well, here was a moment where I was encouraged to look at ASCD. They put out a list of topics, and one was teaching in the moment. And Kathy sent me an email and said, oh, you should do this. You should write an article. It's just short, 750 to 1,000 words. And I thought, oh, right. And then a couple of days after, I thought, well, why not? So I wrote the article, wasn't due till October 1st, and I sent it in about the 12th of September. 2 days later, they said, we want it. We want this article. And so it's going to be published December 8th. And it's called Teaching in the Moment, and it's going to be on ASCD Express. And they have a membership of 125,000 readers across the world. So people who put in 3 principles into the search engine will get that article popping up. So it's just inspired by this moment and inspired by Kathy, and really just a very simple, here's how it's been in my world.
It's a beautiful piece. And I really have to just say, you know, the universe takes care of things. Things happen with synchronicity, if you will, because Brett, today you made arrangements for Martin Richards to be on this webinar. At the moment, his camera is not on. If he is listening or picks up this recording, I would love to hear from him, because technology has served us well. Martin has a Facebook group dedicated to worldwide coaching and education in a variety of ways, invites all kinds of participants to be there. And he posted the notice about this ASCD Express newsletter, where your article will be published. So Martin is on this call, meeting you for the first time and hearing for the first time that he spotlighted the opportunity, and you've been selected as the one to be featured. So it's fabulous. I'm going to mute you, Barb, at this point, because we have a little bit of a distortion, I think, coming. And Deb, because you are on short time, yes, please give us your response.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, to me, what Barb said just makes sense. I was just put in a position where I have to do some things that I've never done before, and I think that whole trusting your instincts, or trusting where you're at and being happy where you're at, it's so huge, because I'm doing things that I've never ever swore I would never do and didn't want to do, but now it's like, okay, I can do this. And I think when you are in a place where you feel comfortable, like trust yourself, you don't have to worry about the things that are coming at you. You can be more comfortable not knowing, and know that things will just happen the way they should. And I mean, when I said something one time, I went, gee, where did that come from in my brain? You know, I was surprised I said it the way I did. And I think part of that is just because you just get yourself into a good place and you feel comfortable with that. And I think with my parents and my students, what I found over the long haul, since I've been doing it, is, first of all, we teach the kids, we don't teach the parents. But what I think is interesting is the parents are asking the kids, what are you talking, what's going on? I want to learn more. And then they're coming to us saying, we want to do a class with the adults. We want to do, we want to learn more. We want to find out more about this. And when I found that parent at the global conference in Minneapolis, I was just shocked. You know, here's a lady that I didn't think got it, and she didn't at the time, but obviously has learned so much and now really gets it. You just don't know. But what I do know is that it's got a long-term effect. And I know that because when I do those when my kids are graduating and they are leaving to go to out in the world, I always interview them and say, what do you remember about the 3 principles? What do you remember about what I taught you? And they still can tell me things and how that it's helped them. And to me, that's a long-term effect that I never expected and was surprised about. And so I think that everybody that's doing this is creating a ripple wave, if you want to call it, of a good thing that will continue for a long time. So it's, to me, the positive effects, finding them later on and just having the parents coming and get interested in it is probably what I think I've seen the most that's impacted me. And I'm just impressed with everything I've heard. You guys are awesome. It's really been fun to sit and listen and hear what you guys have. I think that it's been a great learning experience for me especially. I've learned a lot.
Thank you, Deb. And I want to address this to Martin Richards. Had he not posted the opportunity and Barb not noticed with her years of experience that Deb Bell was very clearly describing teaching in the moment with her students, teaching from insight, if you will, we might not be exactly where we are today with that publication. Barb had lived all of that, but what we're looking for is what can we count on? And what's true is that every one of you who has been working in schools as employees long-term and has learned, lived, and begun to share the principles with kids and with staff, you know that you can count on the flow of insights to fully prepare you, regardless of what subject matter you are teaching, to be able to teach in the moment. And that comes because you're in a very clear state of mind, you're in a state of health, you are in touch with the essence of you. And I'm always curious as I watch all of your faces to, discover what you're thinking at the moment. And of course, I always like to watch Marika because her facial expressions are just wonderful. So I'm going to unmute you and I will go back, Marika, to you. What have you noticed in this year-long process that you would say, I can bet the farm on this is what really does happen given all we've heard from everybody?
Well, I'll go back to what Barb said, and that it comes from inside. And each of us have that place of knowing where we're on, we have that intuition, that inside knowing that guides us in every situation. And I like how Deb Bell described jumping into a new situation and still having that inside knowing. And it's just that common thread that those principles are at work. And when we slow our thinking down and become aware of that going on, we're so much more powerful. And we see it in our kids. It just naturally, something happens that is sometimes beyond my understanding. And that when you watch a face of a child, when you're working with a child, regardless of what the topic is, but when you see the face change, you know it's at work. And whether we talk about it and describe with the students exactly what's going on, or teach them, or it happens without the discussion as well. They get the feeling of the confidence that you have in their knowing and in their growing. It's a remarkable thing.
One of the things that comes to mind as you say that it can happen without words, that there is a connection, a felt connection. Two things. John Hattie, in his meta-analysis of something like 900 educational improvement studies, ends up putting in the top 3 of causes of better outcomes with students two things that are very much tied to what you're talking about and what it means to bring an understanding into your classroom in the form of sharing what you have been living. That can be without words. It can be a shared connection. Parker Palmer calls that the inner landscape, that we're longing for the connection to the largeness of life. And we know it. We don't necessarily put words to that, but it's a felt thing. It's what Brett, in a way, was talking about a couple webinars ago about being in that swimming pool and not being able to hear anything, but being deeply touched. And he called it a sixth sense. He said, I don't want to call it that, but in truth, that's real. That there is a felt, I'll just say a felt connection, and people can put their own words to it. But what John Hattie identified in his massive research was that of the 150 major effects that he had identified from those studies that were causing whatever outcomes resulted. In the top 3 were 2 that are really critical. One is that the student needed to hold the view naturally that he or she could learn well. That's a student thought, a student perspective, a student view. That makes a huge, huge difference. And a little bit further on down, the third major cause was a teacher believing that I can teach every single child, regardless of circumstance, regardless of ability, regardless of all the things that are going on in that child's personal world. And what we're really talking about is the understanding that the experience of the student, the experience of the staff person, to meet in the middle, as Barb talked about it in one of her presentations, where the teacher and the student needed to meet in the window, at the window. That was the middle for the child that was afraid of school. Remember that? When the teacher's thinking and the student's thinking are such, then that magical moment that is experienced and described by you can happen. So thank you, Marika, for pointing that out. Joel, I'm going to put you on the spot, if that's all right, and ask you, because you came into this last fall somewhat new to the principals, certainly as a consultant outside of schools, and as you had learned the principles, it became your dream to be able to do your consulting work inside of schools so as to share the principles with students. So over the course of this year, what have you discovered, shared in, that has made a difference in your work that is growing in schools? What are the essential lessons that maybe found their way into your day-to-day work as you go into schools?
First of all, I apologize. It sounds like a war zone here. There's all kinds of construction and gardening going on outside my window.
We're okay. That's just noise.
And also thank you for your kind comments earlier. I don't feel like I've done that much yet, except knocked on a lot of doors and spoken before some school groups. I guess the lesson that first comes to mind is that the thought that I didn't think I could do it was just a thought. And if I pushed through that and just kind of did some stuff anyways, it kind of made something sort of happen with some people. Not to be too specific there. I'm also struck by the fact of kids' capacity to get this sometimes seemingly easier than adults that I talk to. I recently was asked to work with a friend's son who's an 11-year-old for a month, like once a week for a month. And the first session we had was so amazing because he got it like in just a few moments. And just to be sure, I asked him what he had gotten, and he reflected back. He said, well, like if I'm afraid, I don't have to be afraid of the thing I'm afraid of. I could know it's just a thought, and then I don't have to be, just expressed it so beautifully. And he said, thank you, I never thought of this before. Of course, then we had run out of things to talk about. And it was a learning experience trying to come up with ways to continue the rapport. But when I asked his mother, I said, I had been sharing the principles with her. I said, had you shared anything with him before we spoke? She said, no. So his his ability to just have it sink in, make sense to him right up the bat, and retain it was astonishing to me.
Yeah. You're making a really profound statement, because you're saying, realizing that your own thinking that you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
That's what John Hattie was talking about in the research. Saying teachers having blinders on. I can't reach this kid, or I can't reach any kid. And the simplicity with which the young person, the child that you were talking to, was able to just hear it.
Yeah.
And then you knew, when he didn't exactly have words to go beyond a little bit of conversation, you knew that you were going to have to continue to have deeper and deeper rapport with him so he could be comfortable. Okay, now, I love the kind of thing you've brought for two reasons. First of all, this webinar series was set up to historically collect educators with experience who've been employed inside of school systems. I'm going to mute you now. This was set up to bring together educators with experience so that we can learn from each other, we can collect history, we can document what this looks like in schools. This is the first time there's a picture being painted of what does it look like inside of real schools over long periods of time by people who are educators. But we know that it is critical that others who are outside of schools are also part of this effort to bring the principles to schools. And I'll tell you honestly, one of the comments that I heard Krista make when you were new to this series, Joel, she said, I am so excited that he's there, that he's touching on LA schools, even if it's a little. And I think the point here is that although there's been a webinar featuring experienced principle-based educators, that did not mean in any way, shape, or form that everyone isn't welcome, needed, and encouraged to reach children wherever you can, in schools, in nonprofits, in families, in social service agencies. That's a message that needs to be remembered when this recording is finished. Everybody is needed, and we welcome you. Thank you for hanging on for a year, Joel. That's amazing. You've got a network of people you can connect with if you need. At this point, I think what I want to do is talk just a tiny bit about what has happened as a result of us being connected. And by that, I mean, in terms of personal relationships, there have been some very deep, established connections that are actually taking us in the direction of producing products, resources, programs that are valuable to the whole of the Three Principles community. And we'll talk about those and make, a kind of a list available at a later point. I'm also aware that a very busy teacher has stepped into the fray. And so, Susan, I'm going to unmute you. Hi, Susan Wolfram.
Hi.
We're talking about the value of this webinar series, having brought so many experienced and dedicated and new people together. And one of the side effects of that is that people have collaborated, worked together. And as you know from the last time, you all heard Sue say that she was beginning to pilot in a modified form Krista Campsell and Jane Tucker's My Guide Inside intermediate curriculum, along with other things that she's done. So we knew you were flying from third grade to fourth grade to third grade classes for little short bits of time. How has it gone? What's it looking like? And how many weeks into this are you about?
I am through the chapter 3, I believe. And what I am doing is I'm only getting like 15 minutes at a time. So I'm taking like at least 2, and I get 2 mornings in each class, except for one class I only get 1 morning, so I have to condense it. But I've been doing like one chapter, although I have been sidetracked because what I'm also doing is including and weaving through the principal study the mindfulness lessons that we are doing in our district. So those fit in just beautifully. So I'll weave those in with whatever the mindfulness, whatever the resiliency lesson is that I'm teaching. So we had one on the caring and sharing chapter. I was able to weave in the mindful caring and acts of kindness. And then when we have a section on our busy mind, when we talk about our mind being busy, that is what mindfulness is all about, is recognizing that your mind is busy, your mind is full, and you're not being very mindful. So we talk about mindful listening is the same as clear channel listening. So I'm able to, and so it takes me maybe sometimes an extra lesson or an extra week, and then I move on to the next chapter and infuse the mindful lesson after I teach the principal lesson. Then I bring in the mindful lesson and how that is connected with being mindful. So it's working out just beautifully, and I really feel like I feel like we're preaching to the choir, though. That's what I feel badly about. Like all of us are the ones that already know it and teach it and use it, and I just want it to get out there. And I'm hoping that the classroom teachers that I am in now can start to see the usefulness of it, and how the 3 principles that I'm bringing in now is really the foundation and an important piece that mindfulness does not have by itself, especially the part about the inner wisdom, which is the focus of the curriculum. So I keep coming back to that being mindful means you are tapping into that inner wisdom and that inner guide and that strong voice inside you. So I feel like it's a very important part. And if we could put those 2 together, we'd have something very powerful. So
thank you so much for your comment. And I want to kind of raise this to a higher plane. And that is that all over the world, there are school districts like yours where mindfulness programming has been mandated. And it takes a real dedication and creativity to be able to see the principles as the foundation on which mindfulness sits. And it's all kinds of things. It requires skillful teaching when you're having to fit things together. But it also means that you're able to connect this to something students are already required to learn. And you're taking it deeper. And I just applaud you because, Lori Smith, you're sitting in this webinar, and we'll talk to you a little bit later. But about 9 months ago, she was calling me as principal from her school in Menominee, asking, how on earth do we merge or walk side by side with the required mindfulness initiative that has just been funded by a grant to our district? And so that's going to go forward because the money is there, and yet we don't want to lose what we've been spending so much time and energy and hope on. So Sue, you're the real living example of what I call fitting in.
And it just, because it's become such a way of my thinking, it just comes so naturally. for me. I'll look at a chapter and read it and teach it, and all of a sudden all these other pieces just fit together so beautifully, because things that are real and true somehow always come to the top. And so I would be thrilled to work with Lori or anybody. I mean, I just went through chapter by chapter and saw where the pieces would fit together so beautifully and support and strengthen each other.
Yeah. You made a significant comment here. You said, I've been living this so much that bringing it into teaching was natural. Can I put you on the spot to talk just a tiny bit about one aspect of your personal life related to a family member's health issue? And the reason I'm doing this is one of the things that I know we can bet the farm on when we begin to integrate principles into the school system. As staff learn the principles for themselves and begin living them, there is a powerful impact on personal lives. And we can't underestimate that, because I don't know of anything else that schools do that are that powerful in impacting private life in a way that leaves us dedicated for life to what we've learned, because it's true. So would you just give a snapshot of the story about your situation? Just a little bit. Thank you.
I mean, I saw the power and the principles just in dealing, first of all, with my relationships with my children, with my husband. It just became a very powerful tool for that. And then a couple of years ago, it was in 2014, my son was diagnosed with a very serious cancer, sarcoma. And through that time, especially the beginning time of the great unknown and the prognosis and whether the chemo was going to be effective and all those things, I found that the principles were just knowing that I had to pay attention to my thinking, and that was the key thing in whether I was going to be able to, whether I was going to fall apart or whether I was going to be able to be supportive. And I wanted so desperately to be supportive of him and my other children, and yet inside I could feel myself starting to fall apart with the worry and the anxiety, and being able to pay attention to my thinking and looking at what I was doing made a huge difference. It wasn't the wonderful answer that got me, you know, into this wonderful place where I could just do anything, but it did keep me from going down into the depths of worry and despair and not being of any help to anyone. And so it just totally, and it went on for the next year or two, even last year when after he was a year past and he had a full PET scan and he was having other symptoms that we all were afraid were the cancer coming back. And I remember sitting in that doctor's office waiting for what seemed like hours and just trying to calm myself down and get rid of those thoughts that were totally crippling me and not allowing me to be supportive at that time. And it was very helpful. And so that's just really helped carry me through this.
There's a part of your family story that's so moving to me, because she's talking about adult children who are, you know, beginning.
This is my son who just turned 30 in the midst of all this, right?
A career professional halfway across the country from where Sue is.
Yeah.
The beauty of learning the principles over time and living them is that allowed Sue's entire family to learn from her before this crisis ever came up. And as they made plans to rotate, travel, and be with their son, you know, it's coming and going for a couple of years.
Yeah, because he's not married, and so we needed to be with him. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an amazing story of family change and of how that then is the foundation. That's the living of the principles that allows her to share so effectively with.
And I was very lucky that my sister is also one who follows and lives the principles. And so she was able to help keep me there and remind me and support me. And I think that is so key having that support of other people that have that framework that you do to get you back on track when you're losing track. And that's where I think it would be really helpful as school, as all of us colleagues can work together and help keep each other on track.
Yeah. Thank you so much. At this point, I will certainly welcome you to raise your hand from time to time. And Brett, if you see a hand go up, you might have to wave at me because I'm both presenting and hosting today, which is like a full plate. And the second part of this webinar series, actually today, focuses on looking at what are the keys to essential systems change. That's a big issue. And I want to make it as simple as I can. And I'm going to ask Brett to, in a minute, put up a PowerPoint that I can share with you and still keep speaking to you, okay? As he's doing that, I will continue to talk. You can put that up, Brett, at this point. And in the private forum on Supermind, you will find PDFs of some very important supportive documents. And I'll just mention what those are at this point so you can maybe jot it down. There will be one that is a summary of the evaluation outcomes for our work at the center with 800 subjects in St. Cloud and Menominee. And there is extremely high statistical significance described there. So it may be helpful to people later on to be sure, we can bet the farm, that when staff are introduced to the principals, they do have a version of experiences like Sue has just described. Personal improvement in their mental well-being and improvement in their dedication to sharing the principles with students and seeing that it makes a difference. There's another PDF there that documents something on mindfulness. It's from the Garrison Institute, but the reason that second PDF, which is called Finding an Evidence Base for Mindfulness, is there. It documents from a researcher's perspective the steps one needs to go through to do the kind of research that educators are expected to produce when they walk in and say, let's implement the principles. That's the gold standard that we want to aim for one day. Today, we do not have that kind of research. We have very powerful, credible, what I would call evaluation outcomes. This webinar series provides qualitative evidence. And so at this point, I want to talk with you just a little bit about what I see as being essential ingredients if we want to go beyond just bringing a classroom of students a program on the three principles that teaches them, that one class, something about the understanding, or a short course that does something for teachers. And I'm not opposed to those things. But if our goal is to institutionalize, systemically change how schools are operating, these are the kinds of things I would like to have us know. This will be in the recording, so you can come back and visit this. I want to just reiterate that there is a process for doing system change with the principals in schools, and it's what we've said all along. You learn, you live, you share. and I'll have you advance it, Brett. But educational systems change involves two kinds of things. It involves the essential curriculum and then an essential strategy of change. And so you can advance. Educational systems change when it's involving the essential curriculum is best described for me in Barb's book called The Essential Curriculum. If you are an educator who is not familiar with the principles, be you an administrator or a staff person, you can pick that book up and understand what it means to change the climate in your school or have caring relationships. Barb doesn't use those terms, but readers unfamiliar with the principles can read that book and know that it aligns with the best of what educational improvement research has said we need to have in place. So you can advance. You can advance again. We're not here in this moment talking about the specific 3 principles in the terms of mind, thought, and consciousness. That's a given. We do that, and we do it in a variety of ways as we work inside of schools. But for me, if I'm just trying to get my head around what is it that we're wanting really for educators to realize, discover for themselves, it's something that reads like this. There is a knowing, a natural wisdom, universal mind, guiding spirit in all of us, in all human beings. And privately, we give that many, many names. Okay? When we are still, or when we are free of busy thinking, we can experience our essence, deep connections, meaning, hope, and resilience arise unbidden, and we are free. And that changes everything. Now, I want to make a little side comment here, and that is that a little bit of teaching the principles, sharing the principles, goes a very long way. And I'm not very judgmental about how someone should share the principles. But I am really stern about you have to be living it and seeing it in your lives. And that's why Brett's comment and his story was so important, because there is something that's formless that we realize, and that's very, very important. You can advance to the next one. If I were to say it very simply to somebody who wasn't familiar with the principles, and I was talking about this in a meeting at schools, I might focus on a rather generic statement that would go something like this. Just as predictably as the seasons, these 3 principles operate within all of us in exactly the same way. We are the principles. And from there are lots of other things you can say, but can you see how a general statement like this that's true can accommodate a variety of ways of sharing the principles, whether you're doing it from a, shall I say, a formless, more spiritual perspective, or you're doing it from a psychological perspective, or from the popular current paradigm perspective, the single paradigm. This statement holds true regardless of how you teach that. So you can go to the next one, please, Brett. And another given is absolutely true. It's what Parker Palmer was getting at when he says, we all desire to be connected to the largeness of life. And this is a visual that really depicts 6 degrees of separation. But just as we all came together on this webinar and discovered we're connected in the most surprising and intricate ways. I mean, why is Martin Richards here today? He's connected. And I'm delighted that he is. And he'll be shocked that Barbara took him up on what he posted and followed through. So 6 degrees of separation. It's one world. We're all connected. We operate in the same way. And that's a very hopeful message. You can bet on that one. You can bet the farm for sure that we're connected in this way. So would you advance to the next one, please? Now, educational systems change. There's an essential strategy. And the strategy involves a lot of kind of intricate, detailed, tedious things. This is when you just plain have to do the details. And I'm going to ask you to advance to the next, Brett. For sure, as in any systems change effort, any big new project we take on, there has to be readiness for it. Somebody in Joel's contact in the school system in Los Angeles needs to say, we think we need to talk to you. Or they need to have had an experience where a family member or a student or a staff member has something like what happened to Sue, and she's talked about it. And folks are ready. Sometimes readiness depends in school districts on there being a crisis. You know, a student has been killed, a faculty person has died, or the budget has been cut. I've been called in when people were really ready finally to hear how to reduce their own discomfort and pain, when everybody in a particular elementary school building was getting their pink slip in March. And the principal knew about the 3 principles and resilience. And she called me in and she said, let's do a one-day in-service for all of these people because they've been notified that they're going to lose their jobs. She was ready. There has to be a readiness. You cannot go in and, shall I say, cold sell the principles. At minimum, whether you're already inside the system or outside, we need to be in service. And that is the sensed relationship that Marika talks about. And once that readiness is there and you're in service, whether you're inside or outside the district, then the learning for the organization, for the staff, can take place. And out of that then comes the natural shift, meaning getting ready, having the desire to say, we need to share this with our students. I have a principal in mind who once was introduced to the 4-day training and then finally just raised his hand and he said, I cannot ethically withhold this from our students at the alternative school that I'm the principal for anymore. I haven't a clue how I'm going to actually share the principles with these very high-risk, end-of-the-road kids, but I'm going to do it. And a couple days later, he called and he said, I figured out how. I'm going to have a book and 4 kids, and we will just read from that book for as long as it takes for some questions to rise, and then we'll discuss them. He went like that for a year with these kids, and I went in to evaluate what happened to them. They were changed. Their parents were asking them for the materials. That's the kind of welcoming the unknown that principal was doing. His shift, his desire was so great that he was no longer afraid of the unknown. That's what Joel was talking about. Okay, next. Now, I want to just explain. Oftentimes when I start a presentation or a discussion with staff, I'll say, we're not talking principles. We're just talking Kathy Marshall Emerson and how I see this thing of being human. And actually, I developed this because I had to speak to some judges. to introduce. They wanted to know about the principles, but I thought, how in 4 hours do you do this? And it dawned on me, we're going to talk about this whole thing of what I mentioned before, the car needing 4 wheels. Healthy human beings have at least these 4 dimensions: intellectual, physical, emotional, and spiritual. And the one that's always left out in public settings is spiritual. So we have to talk about, what do we mean by spiritual? It's not frightening. The vast majority of our participants come in and do a pretest and indicate that they have a very high degree of spirituality. And we're careful to say we are not talking about religion. High percentage. You can count on that. People know what that means if you can get comfortable talking about it. So advance to the next. I always fall back on the work of Parker Palmer. And this is a bit cut off, but he is so well accepted in education circles. And he says, by spiritual, I simply mean the diverse way we answer the heart's longing to be connected to the largeness of life. That longing that animates love and work, and especially this work called teaching. Okay. So you find words that are non-offensive. In Canada, in England, there actually are pieces of legislation or rule that require or support spiritual development of students. That's a breakthrough. And at some point, we'll ask Barb and Krista and Marika to, not today, but in another time, maybe identify that new public position and post it on the private forum. Please advance to the next. Another thing we have to do is be very clear about what we mean by resilience. The vast majority of people have always thought that resilience is bouncing back, and that's because that was the earliest era of resilience research. There have now been 5 distinct stages of resilience research documented by Ann Maston. And I'm hoping that there will be an additional evolving fairly soon. I spoke in Halifax at the International Resilience Research Conference with 400 people in 2015 and suggested that we need to move in the direction of looking at research that examines the inner aspects of resilience, meaning spiritual resilience. And so my definition for all time has been just simply this. We're not talking about bouncing back. Certainly there are things in the environment that are important and have to be there as protective factors. But resilience itself is our natural innate capacity to navigate life successfully, and the opportunity to learn how we operate, shall I say, from the inside out, makes the critical difference whether one realizes resilience or not. You might say manifests resilience, because in research, resilience has been measured not by the capacity itself, but by the outward signs that someone is behaving in a, quote, resilient manner. So we have to be very careful. That makes a huge difference. This ties with John Hattie's research and lots of other educational studies, because we're talking about looking deeper, looking to the internal protective mechanism, the innate health that an individual has. Sid Banks identified that in such a beautiful, simple way, shared that with the world, and that's really what this definition of resilience is pointing towards. Advance to the next, please. There will be, and Brad, I don't know if you have the option to reduce that screen just a little bit, because we're missing a couple of points there. I will not talk about all of these today in the interests of time, but there are many considerations in an educational system. When you say, I'm going to take on the entire school district, and the surrounding community as a system. And this is going to be a 20, 25-year project, as ours have been. There are questions to answer. Do you focus on students or do you focus on adults, as an example? I would bet the farm that if you focus on the adults, you will get the biggest bang for the buck, because those adults will then in turn serve all of the students that come into their classroom for their entire professional career. Going in and presenting to 30 students here, 30 students there is a wonderful special program. But have you thought about students or adults? Do you want to reduce teacher stress and probably give them a label? Or do you want to focus on the increasingly complex lives of students? You could go all the way through this long list and have a staff discussion. These things will be posted in the private forum. A very big question: how will you use Sid Banks's materials? That's not so much governed by what you want to do, but what is appropriate to the system that you're going to work with. Is a subtle or a very direct, explicit approach best suited to that district? How does internet visibility of everything that's said about the three principles now affect the work that you might do with a given district if you're in that? So there's many, many things that you think about in terms of systems change. And it's just a matter of, you take one of these and you just listen to your wisdom. You're going to know what the answer to that is. But if you don't think about these things carefully, meaning quietly, insightfully, you might get off track. Advance to the next, please. If you want to institutionalize for a lot of years, and this is tough, I would not say that we have formally institutionalized. There have been times when we have, and I'll ask Gary Johnson to possibly speak about that if we have time just a little bit, because there was a period of time in Menominee where we had the perfect storm with a given superintendent. But I contend that you have to have formal authorization if you're going to do a systems change effort, and that you need a designated leader for the effort. You have to have an infrastructure that supports. I mean, this is just educational infrastructure and a supportive administration, curriculum. First thing people are asking is, well, what's the curriculum? Luckily now, we're starting to see curriculum develop in a few places. Thank goodness, Krista and Jane have made their contribution. You need a strategic plan, or at least to be in the district's strategic plan. And then for there to be academic commitments. By that I mean classes, time, all of those kinds of things that allow the educator to eventually be moving to, let's say, as they are in Menominee or in Boyceville, actually having the lessons in the principles meet a state requirement for mental health education. So I'll just ask you to advance to the next. Budget, local hot issues, system challenges like turnover, legislation, all kinds of things are a part of what you have to deal with. So obviously all of this suggests that you need a long-term view. You need personnel who can have various responsibilities in that. Now we're talking about the ideal. And if you don't have any of that, then you carry on with learning, living, and sharing the principles in your classroom. That's a system too. So with that, I'm going to ask you to advance to the last one here. And just simply, this happens to be the logo for our center, but in a way it's a good place to conclude on the systems change, because it's important that when you take this on, you live in a state of humility, that you see the strength and the beauty of all of the people involved in that system, children, adults, and so on, and that you genuinely, purely be in service. And all of that happens if you're living from your essence, if you are connected to that essential curriculum that Barb so beautifully spells out. And with that, Brett, I'm going to ask you to remove the PowerPoint, please. So we're back. And at this point, Brett, I'm going to ask you to set up the Jeanette Long video, if you would. That will run about 7 minutes. And Gary, I'm going to ask just for about 2 minutes from you to comment about what, in your experience, has been most needed to assure some kind of ongoing life of the principles in your system and community.
Yeah, well, I've retired from the system during the last 2 years, and so I've been able to witness how important it is that the people had, as you started out talking about, the grounding and the deep effects that it has had on people personally. And I just know that as a facilitator of that process for these years, that it was that grounding that was most important. And as the continuation on into the future, I think it's still linked to that. And for people like Laurie Smith, who is now in a leadership role, and Bonnie Shield, that are able to, because of their grounding, to be able to keep articulating the understanding in ways that people can understand and link it to existing programs, as you mentioned. So it seems that grounding is so critical. And then finding ways to understand how a public school system works, and that way they're able to see the opportunities that arise and to the logical applications that can take place. But I think that grounding is critical.
What Gary's talking about is really exhibited in a final video that I want to share with you, because we are saying learn, live, share the principles, and we're saying that you can count on, if you do that, your own life is permanently changed, permanently improved. And so is the life of every student or staff person you touch. On the 18th of September, Brady Hughes and I were able to interview an educator from St. Cloud, Minnesota by the name of Jeanette Long. And I want to just tell you that she was 2 days into hospice when she and I connected by phone, and I asked her if she was still willing to do a filmed interview. And she said, I would be honored. I would be honored. So this is a part of her message. Home editing. Brett knows I'm just learning to splice footage together, so forgive some blips. But please listen to the deep impact this woman has had because of her deep understanding of the principles that she learned way off here in Minnesota. And I invite you to meet Jeanette Long. So when you think back on your years of bringing the principles to students, what stands out as a memorable experience where you saw a student change or you saw something make a huge difference in their lives?
Oh gosh, so many. I mean, on the one hand, I would say it was the day-to-day. Just the fact that the kids were showing up for school. And what a victory that was. But I think the thing that stands out the most is a few months ago, they had a benefit for me. And they made a flyer and they asked some students to say something about me. And the things that came out were just so beautiful. Things like, I realized I can be calm. I realize that I am good. I realize that you're the first person who's given me hope. And that's all I wanted, was to be able to give those kids hope and for them to know that they're loved and that they can be healthy. So that's probably the thing that stands out the most.
Do you remember an activity that you did at the alternative school with the blue dot?
Yes.
And what you had the students do to their teachers?
Yes.
Can you tell that?
Absolutely. We were going through a rough patch, and there was tension between staff and students, and just wasn't going well. There was a lot of disrespect. So I sat them all down. I actually brought everybody together so that I didn't do it in separate groups. I brought all the kids together, and I told them the story about the blue dot and the woman in California and the prisoners. And then, so that we talked about it, and I gave them all blue dots and what it meant to them. But then I told them to go out, and the blue dot was theirs to share as well. And so I gave them another one, and they went and they gave it to a teacher. And we made sure each teacher was covered, or each para, every staff, even the receptionist, anybody connected, administration, that they got one and they said something that they were grateful for with them, or something they appreciated about them, or something they did well. And it just flipped the atmosphere.
The remarkable thing about your teaching that always stood out for me was that you could maybe encounter a new activity or a new book or a new aspect of the principles, but then you had the insights that took you to another level of sharing that in your own way with students. That's the heart. That's the art.
Absolutely.
But when you think about school administrators, maybe all over the world,
Yes.
and we know that they're always very busy, money is short, it's difficult to set
Yes.
priorities, there are government regulations, there are local pressures. What would you say about the importance or the role that teaching young people about their innate health, about these principles that allow them to discover that, what would you say to administrators?
Oh, I would say it's the best investments you're ever going to make, because it's about changing the way you think and interact with students. It's not another, oh, here's a 200-page curriculum that we expect you to follow this year for teaching skills or character. Because once you get it and you live it, then it spreads and people see it. And I think it's so important for administrators to go through this too, because it can trickle down. And if you see an administrator being healthy in a crisis, then you can be healthy in a crisis, and then the kids can be healthy in the crisis. So, you know, there's just that small initial investment, and then the rest is just, it's like, that's what we were talking about before, is that communicating, sitting down, talking about it. How are you doing? How is your health? And then that can lead to just some amazing conversations about what's going on at school that they weren't even talking about, and changing attitudes, and becomes a much more positive environment.
Well, let me ask you this. What would you say to Carol today if you had an opportunity, if she were sitting right here?
The only reason I am able to die in peace is because of health realization. and my spirituality. But
They're all one.
right, they're connected. They're the same.
Why is it that you value this for your students?
For the same reason, that they can get through anything if they know the principles.
There you go. That's it.
Yep.
Okay.
They really can. They'll stumble. They'll still make mistakes. Like I said, I still, get angry sometimes. I still get upset, but it's a quick turnaround, and I make a different choice.
Thank you so much. Jeanette would be pleased to know that her message was shared with you this morning. She passed 1 week after the filming. And what a legacy. The point for sharing all that we have in this year has been to grow the principles, integrate them into schools wherever possible, and to move forward in service to children instead. Let me say this. This has been a journey of love for all of us. This is what we can bet the farm on. This is what happens no matter where you go in the world and begin to share the principles. We find people are beautiful. Thank you.